At the height of fame, the most dangerous truths are rarely spoken under spotlights. They wait for quieter rooms, softer voices, and moments when applause no longer matters. In the final stretch of her life, Rocío Dúrcal was no longer interested in polishing a legacy that the public had already crowned immaculate. Her voice, once radiant and unbreakable, had been worn thin by illness and time. Yet what emerged then was not bitterness but clarity. Not revenge but release. What she shared with those closest to her was not a spectacle for headlines, but a confession shaped by decades of restraint. A confession that challenged the fairy tale of harmony behind the music industry's brightest smiles. To millions, Rocío Dúrcal was grace personified. The Spanish girl who crossed the Atlantic and became the definitive voice of Mexican rancheras. The woman who sang heartbreak with tenderness, who carried sorrow without ever sounding cruel. Her public image was built on warmth and composure, on an almost maternal calm that made audiences feel protected. But that serenity, as it turns out, was not the absence of pain. It was the discipline of swallowing it. For years, Rocío understood that survival in the entertainment world required silence. Silence when disrespected. Silence when displaced. Silence when those she trusted chose ambition over loyalty. Near the end, however, silence became heavier than truth. What appeared to be a late-life confession was, in reality, an open wound that had never healed. Rocío did not summon journalists, nor did she publish memoirs filled with accusations. She simply spoke privately to a small circle that had earned her trust. She named 7 figures from the world she had given her life to. Not to destroy them, not to rewrite history, but to finally unburden herself of what decades of professionalism had forced her to carry alone. These were not enemies in the tabloid sense. They were disappointments. Each name represented a fracture. Ego disguised as genius, indifference dressed as modernity, power exercised without empathy. What makes this moment significant is not the list itself, but the timing. Rocío spoke when there was nothing left to gain. No albums to promote. No tours to protect. No image to negotiate. In that context, truth became weightless. And weightless truth, paradoxically, is often the heaviest of all. Her words were not shouted. They were delivered with the calm of someone who had already forgiven life, if not the people in it. She did not frame herself as a victim. She framed herself as a witness. For years, fans believed her artistic partnership with Juan Gabriel was untouchable. Together they defined an era, producing songs that became emotional landmarks across generations. On stage and on record, their connection felt spiritual. But even sacred bonds can fracture when respect erodes. What the public saw as destiny was, behind closed doors, increasingly strained by control, pride, and unspoken resentment. Rocío never denied Juan Gabriel's genius. What she questioned was the cost of standing too close to it. This pattern repeated itself throughout her career. The industry changed. New stars rose faster, louder, more provocatively. Executives chased novelty. Tradition became expendable. Rocío, who had built bridges between cultures with patience and devotion, watched as longevity was quietly replaced by spectacle. She did not resent youth. She resented amnesia. The way success often forgets who cleared the path. The way humility becomes optional once applause grows loud enough. Her final reflections were not about hatred. Hatred requires energy, and Rocío had spent hers elsewhere. What remained was disappointment sharpened by memory. She understood that fame magnifies character rather than correcting it. That some smiles are weapons. That silence, while elegant, can also be a slow form of self-erasure. Speaking at last was her refusal to disappear quietly behind her own legend. This is where the story truly begins. Not with scandal but with reckoning. Not with names, but with the cost of carrying grace in a world that often mistakes kindness for weakness. And as Rocío Dúrcal reached the end of her journey, she chose something radical. She chose to be honest, even if honesty arrived too late to change anything except her own peace. Rocío did not arrive in Mexico as a conqueror. She arrived as a guest. Despite her success in Spain, she was aware that in Latin America she would always be the foreigner, the one allowed in so long as she respected hierarchies already in place. Early on, she learned to soften her opinions, to smile through discomfort, to treat slights as misunderstandings. This was not weakness. It was strategy. The industry rewarded those who did not complicate narratives. Rocio's narrative was simple and profitable. The gentle Spaniard who honored Mexican music better than many Mexicans themselves. That image, however, came at a cost. Behind the scenes, respect was not always reciprocal. Decisions were made over her head. Invitations were extended and withdrawn without explanation. She watched as producers discussed her future, as if she were a reliable instrument rather than a creative force with agency. And yet she stayed. Because leaving would have meant starting over. Because speaking up would have meant being labeled difficult. And because women in her position rarely won those battles. Her relationship with Juan Gabriel exists at the center of this tension. Publicly, they were inseparable. Privately, the balance of power shifted over time. Juan Gabriel's genius was undeniable. But genius often arrives with gravity, pulling everything toward itself. Rocio began to feel that collaboration had turned into expectation. That her voice, once celebrated as a partner, was increasingly treated as a vehicle. What hurt her most was not conflict, but the gradual disappearance of mutual regard. When admiration becomes entitlement, intimacy collapses. Crucially, Rocio never attempted to expose this fracture while it was happening. In an industry addicted to scandal, her refusal to speak was interpreted as harmony. Fans assumed maturity. Journalists assumed professionalism. Few considered exhaustion. Few asked what it costs to always be the adult in the room. For Rocio, silence became a habit so ingrained that breaking it felt almost unnatural. She carried on performing, recording, smiling, while quietly adjusting her boundaries. Songs once sung with abandon were avoided. Certain names were no longer spoken in rehearsal rooms. Absence replaced confrontation. As the years passed, the landscape around her shifted dramatically. New artists emerged with different values, different aesthetics, different relationships to fame. Youth became a currency more valuable than experience. Provocation replaced patience. Rocio watched from a position that was still privileged but no longer central. Invitations arrived later. Roles grew smaller. Homages felt ceremonial rather than sincere. She was still respected, but in the way monuments are respected. Admired, rarely consulted. This transition exposed another truth she struggled to accept. The industry does not age with its artists. It discards them. Those who survive longest are often those who reinvent themselves aggressively or disappear gracefully. Rocio did neither. She remained faithful to her voice, her repertoire, her sense of dignity. That fidelity, while admirable, made her increasingly out of step with an ecosystem obsessed with novelty. What once made her indispensable now rendered her inconvenient. In private moments she began to articulate what she never would on camera. That some of the people she encountered mistook confidence for arrogance. That success without humility felt hollow to her. That being overlooked hurt less than being dismissed. These were not rants. They were reflections. She did not accuse the world of conspiring against her. She recognized patterns instead. Patterns in how power circulates. Patterns in how women are praised for sacrifice but rarely protected by it. By the time illness entered her life, the urgency to maintain appearances dissolved. Cancer has a way of stripping ambition of its urgency. What remains is inventory. Who stood by you? Who vanished? Who spoke kindly only when it was safe? Rocio began revisiting memories not to reopen wounds, but to understand them. In that process, certain names surfaced repeatedly. Not because they had harmed her the most, but because they symbolized the dynamics she had endured. Ego. Indifference. Silence masquerading as professionalism. It is important to understand that Rocio did not view herself as betrayed by individuals alone, but by a system that normalized these behaviors. She had participated in it. She had benefited from it. And she had paid for it. Her final reflections were less about settling scores than about reclaiming authorship over her own story. For once, she was not the interpreter. She was the narrator. What she shared near the end was not a manifesto. It was a reckoning with memory. A recognition that grace, while powerful, can become a cage if it is never questioned. Rocío Dúrcal had built a career on emotional honesty in song. In her final days, she allowed herself that same honesty in life. Not loudly, not publicly, but truthfully. And in that quiet truth lies the tension that defines the rest of this story. Because once silence is broken, even softly, it cannot be restored. And what comes next is not reconciliation but exposure. Not names as accusations but names as symbols of a world that asked too much and listened too little. By the time Rocío Dúrcal reached the stage of her life where memory outweighed momentum, the people she recalled most vividly were not always the ones who had hurt her directly. They were the ones who embodied change. Change she could not control. Change that quietly pushed her to the margins while smiling politely as it did so. In her private reflections, these figures became symbols rather than villains, markers of an industry that was evolving in ways that left little room for patience, gratitude, or restraint. One of those symbols was Miguel Bose. In public discourse, Bose represented modernity. He was cerebral, provocative, and perfectly attuned to a new cultural rhythm that favored ambiguity over tradition. Rocío did not deny his talent. What unsettled her was what that talent signaled. For the first time, she felt that longevity was no longer a virtue. Reinvention had replaced consistency as the highest currency. When festival lineups shifted and promotional budgets followed younger faces, she understood that this was not personal. And yet, it felt deeply personal. Rocío had built her career slowly, deliberately, song by song, country by country. She believed that respect accumulated through time. Watching that logic dissolve was disorienting. When she perceived indifference from those ascending rapidly, it confirmed a fear she rarely voiced, that the industry was forgetting its own foundations. In her mind, Bose was not an enemy, but a mirror reflecting a world where confidence could slip easily into contempt, where innovation often arrived stripped of reverence. That same sense of displacement followed her interactions with newer female stars, particularly Lucero. Lucero embodied a generational leap. Youthful, charismatic, omnipresent across television and music, she was celebrated as a natural successor to the legacy Rocío had helped establish. The comparison itself did not offend Rocío. What lingered was the absence of acknowledgement. To her, tradition was not a throne passed down automatically. It was a responsibility earned through understanding the weight of what came before. Rocío had crossed oceans to defend Mexican music in places where it was misunderstood, sometimes ridiculed. She had sung rancheras to audiences unfamiliar with their emotional codes and made them listen. That history mattered to her. When she sensed dismissal, even unintentionally, it cut deeper than overt rivalry. Not because she feared being replaced but because she feared being erased. Her disappointment was rooted in the belief that gratitude is the quiet glue of artistic continuity. Without it, every generation begins as if nothing existed before. Her unease extended beyond singers to the world of cinema, where she had briefly but memorably ventured. Figures like Jorge Rivero and Andrés Garcia represented another dimension of the same problem. Power without introspection. Presence without listening. Rocío had entered film sets hoping for collaboration, and encountered competition masquerading as confidence. She noticed how often authority was asserted through belittlement, how masculinity was performed as dominance rather than discipline. These experiences shaped a decisive pivot in her career. Music, unlike film, allowed fewer interruptions. On stage, no one could rewrite her lines or steal her frame. Her retreat from cinema was not a failure of ambition, but a refusal to engage with egos that demanded submission. In her private language, these men were not monsters. They were warnings. Proof that talent, when untethered from humility, corrodes environments rather than elevating them. Perhaps the most painful symbol of all was Sara Garcia. To the public, Sara Garcia was warmth incarnate, the grandmotherly figure who defined tenderness in Mexican cinema. To Rocío, the encounter revealed the cruelty that can hide behind authority. As a young artist entering a foreign industry, she expected guidance or at least neutrality. Instead, she felt judgment. The message, subtle but unmistakable, was territorial. Space was not given. It was defended. This moment stayed with her not because it was dramatic, but because it was formative. It taught her that institutions, even those draped in affection, often resist newcomers. That reverence does not guarantee generosity. Rocío never lost respect for Sara Garcia's legacy, But she carried the disappointment of realizing that icons can guard gates as fiercely as they inspire dreams. That realization matured her quickly. It also hardened her resolve to protect her own dignity, even when it required withdrawal rather than confrontation. As these memories accumulated, Rocio began to see a pattern. None of these figures shared the same role, the same generation, or the same medium. What united them was not malice but imbalance. Moments where power spoke louder than empathy. Where success excused neglect. Where silence was easier than accountability. In naming them privately, Rocio was not constructing an indictment. She was mapping a landscape she had navigated largely alone. Her illness intensified this need for clarity. When time contracts, memory expands. She revisited moments not to amplify grievance, but to understand why certain wounds never healed. The answer was rarely the event itself. It was the absence of repair. No apology. No acknowledgement. No effort to close the distance. In that vacuum, silence hardened into meaning. Rocio understood that the world would remember her as gracious. She accepted that. What she wanted in her final days was for someone to know that grace had been a choice, not a condition. That her calm exterior had been maintained through effort, restraint, and sacrifice. Speaking those names aloud in private was her way of reclaiming the complexity of her own story. This is why her late-life honesty carries weight. Not because it exposes others but because it reveals her. A woman who loved deeply, endured quietly, and finally allowed herself to stop translating pain into politeness. In doing so, she did not dismantle her legacy. She completed it. As Rocío Dúrcal's life narrowed toward its final chapter, her reflections moved away from people and toward principles. The names she had spoken privately were never meant to stand alone. They were markers along a longer internal argument she had been having with herself for years. An argument about what success demands and what integrity refuses to surrender. In that argument, Rocio arrived at a line she would not cross, even if crossing it might have preserved power, relevance, or applause a little longer. She had watched too many careers thrive by bending rather than standing. She understood the mechanics well. A calculated insult disguised as confidence. A public smile that erased a private slight. An apology offered only after reputational damage demanded it. None of this shocked her anymore. What troubled her was how normalized it had become. The industry rewarded those who absorbed humiliation without memory, and punished those who remembered too clearly. Rocio chose memory. This choice isolated her in subtle ways. Invitations still came, but often framed as tributes rather than collaborations. She was praised for what she had been, less often consulted for what she could still create. This transition tested her sense of worth. It is one thing to be replaced. It is another to be politely archived. Rocio resisted both outcomes by refusing to dilute her standards. She would not reinvent herself into something she did not recognize. She would not adopt cynicism as camouflage. And she would not trade sincerity for speed. What defined her moral line was not an aversion to ambition, but an insistence on reciprocity. She believed that talent carried responsibility. That influence required care. That fame, when divorced from humility, became extraction rather than exchange. These beliefs shaped how she responded to disappointment. She did not retaliate. She withdrew. Silence for her was not weakness. It was boundary setting in a world that rarely respected boundaries, unless they were enforced loudly. Illness clarified this philosophy further. As her body weakened, her tolerance for pretense vanished. Conversations became shorter. Social obligations fell away. What remained were questions of meaning. What had been worth protecting? What had not? Rocio understood that she could not control how she would be remembered, but she could control how she finished. Finishing with honesty mattered more than finishing admired. In this period, she revisited her own complicity. She acknowledged the times she had chosen peace over confrontation, not always because it was right, but because it was safer. She recognized that her silence had sometimes allowed patterns to continue unchecked. This self-awareness did not turn into self-reproach. It became context. She had navigated a system that offered women limited routes to longevity. She had chosen the one that preserved her voice, even if it cost her vindication. The distinction between bitterness and clarity became central to her thinking. Bitterness seeks an audience. Clarity seeks relief. Rocio's late-life candor belonged firmly to the second category. She did not want her words to circulate as scandal. She wanted them to land as truth within a small circle that could hold them without exploiting them. This restraint was consistent with her character. Even at the end, she refused to perform pain for consumption. Her understanding of integrity also evolved. It was no longer defined by being agreeable or enduring quietly. Integrity, she realized, could also mean naming what had been endured. Not publicly, not theatrically, but truthfully. By articulating her disappointments, she reclaimed authorship over experiences that had long been framed as misunderstandings or professional inevitabilities. She reframed them as choices made by others, choices that carried consequences even if those consequences were delayed. This reframing allowed her to make peace with the contradictions of her career. She could honor the joy of collaboration without denying the hurt of imbalance. She could celebrate the music without romanticizing the conditions under which it was made. She could acknowledge the love of audiences without mistaking it for protection. In this balance, she found a quiet strength that had eluded her in earlier years. Rocio's moral line ultimately rested on a simple principle: success should not require the erosion of self-respect. She had watched many talented people justify cruelty as honesty, arrogance as confidence, indifference as focus. She rejected these translations. For her, art was inseparable from ethics. How something was created mattered as much as what was created. A beautiful song born of contempt was, in her eyes, incomplete. This belief informed how she approached her final days. She did not seek reconciliation for its own sake. Forgiveness, she understood, did not obligate proximity. She could release resentment without reopening doors that had closed for good reason. Her peace came not from resolution with others, but from alignment with herself. She had lived long enough to know that closure is often an internal act. Those closest to her sensed this shift. She spoke less about industry dynamics and more about values. About kindness that expects nothing in return. About loyalty that does not announce itself. About the quiet dignity of walking away intact. These conversations were not lectures. They were offerings. Rocio was passing on a way of seeing, not a list of grievances. By the time her voice faded, the work had already been done. She had drawn her line, not in public declarations, but in the consistency of her choices. She left behind a legacy that could withstand scrutiny precisely because it was never built on spectacle alone. Her honesty at the end did not contradict her lifetime of grace. It revealed its cost. And it is here, at this intersection of success and integrity, that the story deepens further. Because once the moral line is drawn, the question is no longer who disappointed her, but what she refused to become in response. That refusal, quiet and firm, may be the most radical act of her entire career. After Rocío Dúrcal's passing, something subtle began to shift in how her story was told. Publicly, the tributes followed a familiar script. She was remembered as elegance, as devotion, as the bridge between Spain and Mexico, as the voice that made heartbreak sound merciful. Awards were replayed. Performances were archived. Her image was polished one last time and placed safely among the icons. But beneath that surface narrative, a quieter reassessment was taking place, one that did not seek to contradict her legend, but to deepen it. Those who had heard her final reflections understood that her legacy could no longer be reduced to grace alone. Grace, they realized, had been the visible result of an invisible discipline. It had required restraint in moments when retaliation would have been easier. It had demanded silence when speaking might have shifted blame but not behavior. Rocio's honesty at the end reframed her entire career as an act of sustained moral negotiation. Not survival at any cost, but survival with limits. This reframing challenged the industry's preferred myth. The myth that endurance equals harmony. The myth that longevity proves satisfaction. Rocio's life revealed a more complex truth. One can endure and still be wounded. One can succeed and still be sidelined. One can be celebrated and still be unheard. Her final candor did not diminish her achievements. It contextualized them. It suggested that the beauty audiences admired had been forged in conditions less gentle than the songs themselves. For younger artists, particularly women, this realization carried weight. Rocio's career had long been presented as an ideal path. Disciplined, scandal-free, universally respected. Her late-life reflections exposed the cost of maintaining that ideal. They did not discourage ambition. They warned against erasure. They reminded those coming after her that professionalism should not require self-negation. That silence, while sometimes protective, should never become compulsory. In this light, Rocio's withdrawal from certain spaces late in her career appeared less like decline and more like authorship. She chose where to stand and where not to return. She accepted reverence but rejected condescension. She allowed herself to be honored without pretending that honor repaired every fracture. This selectivity, once mistaken for aloofness, now reads as discernment. The industry itself was slower to absorb this nuance. Posthumous narratives prefer simplicity. They thrive on resolution. Rocio's story resisted both. Her honesty arrived too quietly to ignite scandal, and too late to provoke response. It existed in a space that entertainment culture often overlooks. Truth without utility. There was nothing to market, nothing to correct, nothing to defend. And yet, that very uselessness gave her words durability. They were not shaped by strategy. They were shaped by necessity. Over time, those words began to influence how her work was interpreted. Songs once heard as romantic melancholy took on an added dimension. Listeners began to hear not just heartbreak, but endurance. Not just longing but restraint. Her phrasing, her pauses, her controlled intensity felt less like stylistic choices, and more like survival skills. In retrospect, her artistry seemed inseparable from the emotional intelligence that had allowed her to navigate contradiction without becoming brittle. This deeper understanding also complicated the idea of forgiveness. Rocio's piece at the end was often described as forgiveness, but that word can be misleading. Forgiveness implies reconciliation. What Rocio practiced was release. She did not seek to restore broken bonds or rewrite outcomes. She accepted what had been and let it rest without dramatization. In doing so, she modeled a form of closure that does not require mutual agreement. Closure as an internal alignment, not a negotiated settlement. Her family, who guarded her private reflections with care, recognized the responsibility embedded in them. To sensationalize would have betrayed her intent. To erase would have betrayed her truth. They chose discretion. This choice ensured that her final honesty remained what it was meant to be. A personal reckoning, not a public verdict. In an era addicted to exposure, this restraint was radical. As the years passed, Rocío Dúrcal's legacy settled into a more layered form. She remained beloved, but no longer idealized as untouched by conflict. She became something more instructive. A case study in how to maintain dignity without denying complexity. How to succeed without surrendering conscience. How to exit a system without declaring war on it. This evolution of her image did not happen all at once. It emerged through conversations, through reassessments, through the slow work of listening differently. Critics began to write about her not only as a voice, but as a navigator of power. Fans spoke of her not only with affection, but with respect for what she endured without display. Her silence, once read as compliance, was reinterpreted as choice. In this reinterpreted legacy, Rocio's final honesty stands as a quiet corrective to celebrity culture's appetite for extremes. She was neither saint nor martyr. She was a professional who understood the cost of her profession and chose, at the end, to name it for herself. That act did not ask the world to change its opinion. It asked only to be acknowledged as real. And perhaps that is the most enduring aspect of her story. Not the list of disappointments, not the name spoken in private, but the example she left behind. An example of how to inhabit success without letting it hollow you out. How to leave with your values intact. How to tell the truth when it no longer serves ambition, only peace. With that, Rocío Dúrcal's journey did not close as a cautionary tale, but as a human one. A reminder that behind every immaculate legacy lies a series of choices invisible to the crowd. Choices that define not how loudly one is remembered, but how honestly one lived. What Rocío Dúrcal left behind was not a scandal, but a series of unanswered questions that continue to echo precisely because they resist resolution. These questions do not ask who was right or wrong. They ask something more unsettling. Why does an industry built on emotion struggle so deeply with empathy? Why is silence so often rewarded while honesty is postponed until it no longer matters? And why do so many legacies require distance from the truth in order to remain comfortable? In the years following her death, listeners returned to her music with new ears. The songs had not changed, but the context had. Knowing that restraint shaped her career altered how her performances were felt. Her controlled delivery no longer sounded merely elegant. It sounded intentional. A way of surviving without surrendering. This realization raised an uncomfortable possibility. How many other artists had learned the same discipline, not as a craft choice, but as a protective measure? How many voices had been softened not by taste, but by necessity? Rocio's story also reopened a long-standing tension between success and voice. She had achieved extraordinary reach without ever claiming space loudly. She did not demand recognition for the sacrifices behind her composure. That choice earned admiration, but it also normalized a dangerous expectation. That professionalism requires emotional invisibility. That dignity is proven through endurance. Her late-life honesty quietly challenged that logic. It suggested that the cost of constant composure is rarely acknowledged, even by those who benefit from it most. One of the most persistent questions her story leaves behind is whether things would have been different had she spoken earlier. Would naming disrespect have changed outcomes? Would confrontation have altered power dynamics? Or would it have shortened her career? These questions have no definitive answers, but their existence matters. They reveal how limited the options often are for artists navigating hierarchies that value output over well-being. Rocio's choice to wait was not cowardice. It was calculation shaped by context. Her reflections also complicate the idea of truth-telling in public life. Society often celebrates honesty only when it arrives with drama or consequence. Rocio's truth arrived quietly, without spectacle, without demands. It did not seek to correct history. It sought to unburden a life. That kind of truth is difficult to process because it offers no resolution, no clear antagonist, no satisfying arc. It asks the listener to sit with discomfort rather than consume it. Another unresolved tension lies in how her story intersects with gender. Rocio operated in spaces where authority was frequently expressed through dominance and ego. Her refusal to mirror those traits was framed as grace, but it also limited her leverage. Her experience invites a broader question. How many women are praised for civility while being denied agency? How often is silence interpreted as consent rather than survival? Rocio's career suggests that these dynamics are not exceptions, but structural features. There is also the question of memory. What parts of an artist's life are preserved and which are filtered out? Rocio's family chose discretion, honoring her intent rather than feeding curiosity. That choice preserved her dignity, but left the public with fragments rather than full disclosure. Some critics argue that this limits understanding. Others see it as an ethical boundary. Rocio herself seemed to favor the latter. She believed that not all truths are owed to the crowd, especially when the crowd has no stake in their repair. Her story challenges the assumption that closure must be collective. In a culture that demands public reckoning, Rocio modeled a different path. Closure as personal alignment, as acceptance without endorsement, as peace without reconciliation. This approach unsettles expectations because it refuses to perform healing. It insists that healing can occur offstage, unobserved, unvalidated. Perhaps the most enduring question her life raises is what integrity looks like when it is not rewarded. Rocio did not receive vindication for her restraint. She did not reclaim centrality by naming harm. Her honesty came too late to change structures or reputations. And yet, it mattered. It mattered because it restored coherence between who she was publicly and who she was privately. That coherence, once achieved, did not require acknowledgement to be real. For those who study cultural history, Rocio's journey offers a case study in how systems shape behavior without overt coercion. No single figure controlled her fate. No single event defined her limits. It was the accumulation of small imbalances, unaddressed moments, and unspoken expectations that shaped her decisions. Understanding this helps shift the conversation away from blame and toward structure, toward asking how many similar stories exist unheard because they were lived responsibly. For audiences, the question becomes how to listen differently. How to hear not just what is sung but what is withheld. How to honor artists not only for what they give, but for what they protect. Rocio's legacy invites a more mature form of admiration, one that does not require perfection or purity, but recognizes complexity as strength. In the end, Rocío Dúrcal did not leave behind answers meant to settle debates. She left behind a lens. Through it, success appears less glamorous but more honest. Integrity appears quieter but more durable. And silence, once romanticized, appears as a tool that must be chosen carefully, lest it become a habit that erases the self. These unanswered questions continue to resonate because they belong not only to Rocío, but to anyone who has navigated systems where visibility comes at the cost of voice. Her story does not ask us to judge. It asks us to notice. And in that noticing, perhaps, lies the beginning of a different kind of respect. In the end, Rocío Dúrcal's story does not resolve itself into triumph or tragedy. It settles instead into something quieter and more enduring: coherence. When the applause faded and the machinery of fame moved on, what remained was a life that finally aligned with itself. The truth she allowed herself to speak at the end was not meant to reorder the past or expose the world. It was meant to close a circle she had carried open for decades. For most of her career, Rocío understood herself through service. Service to songs, to audiences, to traditions that were not originally hers but which she honored with devotion. That sense of service shaped her discipline, her restraint, her refusal to turn pain into performance. It also delayed her reckoning. By the time she reached it, she no longer needed witnesses. What mattered was that she recognized her own endurance not as obligation, but as choice. Her final honesty reframes her life less as a narrative of sacrifice and more as one of authorship. She chose when to speak. She chose when to remain silent. She chose which spaces to leave and which values to carry forward. These choices were not always visible, and they were rarely celebrated. Yet they formed the spine of her integrity. In naming her disappointments privately, she did not dismantle her past. She claimed it. This is why her story resists the language of confession. Confession implies guilt. Rocío was not confessing. She was clarifying. She was distinguishing between what had been imposed on her and what she had accepted, between grace as temperament and grace as strategy, between kindness freely given and kindness demanded by circumstance. That distinction, once made, allowed her to rest. The power of her journey lies precisely in its refusal to dramatize itself. In an era that equates meaning with spectacle, Rocío demonstrated another model. A life can be significant without being loud. Truth can be liberating without being public. Closure can be achieved without reconciliation. These are uncomfortable ideas for a culture built on exposure, but they are necessary ones. Her legacy, seen through this lens, becomes less about perfection and more about resilience without corrosion. She did not harden. She did not become cruel in response to cruelty. She did not adopt the language of power to secure her place. Instead, she withdrew selectively, protected her core, and waited until honesty no longer carried risk. That patience was not passive. It was precise. For listeners, this understanding deepens the emotional texture of her work. Her songs do not simply express longing or sorrow. They carry the imprint of someone who knew restraint intimately. Someone who understood that not every feeling needs an outlet to remain valid. That control, once mistaken for softness, reveals itself as strength. For the industry, her story leaves an implicit challenge: to reconsider what it rewards, to question how often professionalism is conflated with silence, to recognize that longevity achieved through self-erasure is not a neutral outcome, but a cost borne quietly by those who refuse to weaponize their pain. Rocío's life suggests that systems rarely change because of late truths, but late truths still matter. They matter because they restore dignity where convenience once ruled. Ultimately, Rocío Dúrcal did not seek to be remembered differently. She sought to remember herself accurately. That act, humble and final, completes her journey. She leaves behind not a cautionary tale, but an invitation. To listen beyond melody. To respect beyond image. To honor not only what artists give but what they choose not to surrender. In that sense, her quiet truth endures not because it shocked, but because it clarified. It reminds us that behind every enduring voice is a person negotiating limits, values, and survival. Rocio did that negotiation with care. And when she was finally done, she left with her voice intact, her boundaries honored, and her peace earned. What remains after the final note is not silence but resonance. Rocío Dúrcal's story lingers because it refuses to resolve into a lesson that can be neatly summarized or safely archived. It stays with us precisely because it mirrors a tension many recognize but rarely name. The distance between who we are expected to be and who we quietly work to protect beneath that expectation. In the years since her passing, her image has remained remarkably stable. She is still remembered as warmth, devotion, and elegance. Yet for those who listen more closely now, that image carries depth rather than polish. It is no longer the portrait of a woman untouched by conflict, but of someone who learned how to live with it without letting it define her. That distinction matters. It shifts admiration away from fantasy and toward respect. Rocio's journey suggests that endurance is not inherently virtuous. It becomes meaningful only when paired with agency. She endured not because she lacked alternatives, but because she calculated the cost of each one. When she finally spoke, she did so without urgency or agenda. That timing was not accidental. It reflected a life spent choosing when truth could heal rather than harm. Her story also reframes how we understand legacy. Legacy is often treated as something bestowed by others, measured in accolades and remembrance. Rocio's final act reminds us that legacy is also something claimed internally. It is the alignment between how one lived and how one understands that life at the end. In that sense, her most important audience was herself. There is no demand in her story for retribution or revision. She does not ask us to reassess the people around her or to reorder the cultural hierarchy she navigated. What she leaves behind is subtler and more challenging. An invitation to consider how many similar stories exist, unspoken not because they lack substance, but because they were lived responsibly. Stories where silence was not absence but labor. For artists, her life offers a quiet framework rather than a warning. It suggests that protecting one's core may require withdrawal rather than confrontation. That dignity can be maintained without dominance. That success does not obligate surrender. These ideas do not translate easily into slogans or strategies, but they endure because they reflect lived reality rather than aspiration. For audiences, her journey encourages a different kind of listening. To hear not only what is expressed but what is contained. To recognize that composure often hides calculation, and that restraint can be an act of self-preservation rather than compliance. In honoring that complexity, admiration matures into understanding. Rocío Dúrcal did not set out to dismantle illusions. She simply refused to carry them any longer once they no longer served her peace. That refusal, quiet and final, completes her story. Not with confrontation, not with vindication, but with coherence. A life lived in alignment even if that alignment arrived late. In the end, her truth endures because it does not ask to be believed. It asks only to be acknowledged. And in acknowledging it, we are reminded that the most lasting legacies are not always the loudest. They are the ones that allow a person to leave the world without having to pretend who they were.